What's going on, everyone? MMATASH here. In this video, I'd like to share with you 5 ways to start taking better photos. Now, when I'm talking about better photos, I'm really referring to composition, or the actual process of creating your photo, figuring out what's in frame, what should be out of frame. And a lot of times what I see, and I've fallen into this trap myself many times, is that you kind of fall onto kind of shooting at eye level. So whether you're kind of holding your camera, you're just kind of standing up and you shoot at eye level, or you've got your tripod at eye level, that tends to lead to a kind of a flatter image. And so what I did was I looked through all of my photos that I've shared. I have a collection in Lightroom where every time I edit a photo and it's ready for sharing, I put it in that collection. And so I looked through it and I found a bunch of themes. And so this is actually going to be a new kind of video series that I want to work on, specifically focused on composition ideas. So we're going to start with 5 in this one. I've got my new iPad Pro. I figured I'd use it. I actually really love it, but that's another conversation. So what we're going to do is look at photos. I created these individualized albums for each of the 5 tips that I want to share. And I'm going to walk you through why I think they make stronger photos because of the tips. And so with that, let's start with tip number 1, which is all about changing your perspective. I just talked about how a lot of times either I'll see myself falling at eye level or I see other people just shooting at eye level. And you'd be surprised at how something as simple as changing your perspective can impact your photo in a very, very meaningful way. So when I talk about changing perspective and not shooting at eye level, what I mean is like this kind of a photo where, when this guy was coming through, this was in Havana, Cuba, he was walking down, and the first thing I did was I wanted to kind of shoot at angle so that you kind of have the street and the buildings here creating these really strong lines. But I also kind of got close to my knees as he approached. I got low. Rather than kind of shooting right at him, I kind of got low. So you get this, if you look at the angle of his food cart, it kind of matches these angles. They kind of go towards the vanishing point together. And that leads to a more interesting shot than if I was just kind of standing at eye level. We're always standing and we're looking at things at eye level. So if you can present your viewer with kind of a different angle, a different take on that, it'll help big time. Same thing here. So I took this photo several years ago in Nicaragua. It was at a place called Uncle Tio's, and he brings in children, all kinds of people that come in, and they work to make these hammocks. Now I got really low. I saw this kid, he was working on these hammocks, the yarn. And by getting low, I'm able to get this really interesting perspective. I focused over here on the yarn itself, rather than him. So he dropped out of focus. Typically, sometimes with people, it is not very flattering to shoot up at them, but if they're falling out of focus, it's a little bit easier. But because we're low, we're kind of creating this sweeping line upward, which I think is really, really nice. And it would be a lot less effective if I was just kind of shooting at him, even through the yarn. So because we kind of changed perspective, we went from low to high, I think it really worked. And then same thing here. I found this kind of like beaten up truck in Truckee, or kind of near Truckee, California. And rather than kind of standing at eye level where, I would have the windshield going, where you just see through the windshield, that's kind of boring. So what I did was I just dropped my tripod legs and splay them out a bit. And I got lower so that look at all the really cool detail of the tire and the engine block. And the color of these wires, there's a lot here going on. And because I got lower, we kind of started skewing the main lines of the car. And so the composition itself looks to be a lot more interesting than shooting at eye level. So that's tip number 1, is really kind of thinking about your perspective and changing it. Don't always focus on eye level. Tip number 2 is all about incorporating scale. Now, when I talk about scale, what I mean is you're using either your relationship from yourself to your subject or your subject to the rest of the scene to convey kind of a sense of height or a sense of size. And a lot of times what I'll do is, for example, I'll go way far back, even with a telephoto lens, and I'll photograph a person. Now, the reason why people, I think, are so effective to convey a sense of scale is because, for the most part, we can kind of gauge the general height of a person, right? Like somewhere between 5 feet and 6.5 feet, generally speaking, globally, is the height of a person. So a person. It's not like, a little dog is walking around. A person can generally get an idea. It's like, oh yeah, That person is about that tall. So here, when I have my buddy Brian standing all the way in the distance by this waterfall, I'm 6 feet tall and he's a few inches taller than me. So, it gives you a sense of the magnitude, the enormity of the scene. And that's why I think when you focus on scale, same thing here, Multnomah Falls. Like, this is the Benson Bridge. There are a bunch of people here. And when you kind of take that into perspective and you look at the size of them compared to the rest of the scene, it gives you a really great idea of just how big Multnomah Falls is. It's actually a massive waterfall. Same thing here. This was at Ecola State Park on the Oregon coast. If I bring up the EXIF, I took this with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens at 200 millimeters. So I was, that was really far, but still these people look really small, and it gives you kind of a sense of the drop off of the cliff. And then again, my buddy Brian, this is to convey the sense of scale of these redwood trees at Jedediah Smith State Park in California. Again, I'm 6 feet tall, he's a few inches taller than me, and you can see just how gigantic that tree is if he's standing by it. So again, when you really want to convey the enormity of a scene, try to find a subject that people can relate to and that can juxtapose, their size versus the enormity of the scene, and that is introducing a sense of scale. Tip number 3 is all about looking for angles. So this is what I talked about at the head of this video, where a lot of times we tend to shoot head on, meaning at eye level, straight ahead. And this is a perfect example of this boardwalk at Death Valley National Park. It's great and everything, but the way it kind of goes like this and then over, I don't know, to me it falls flat. So all I did was I just changed my angle. I looked for a different way to convey the boardwalk, and now it goes completely through the frame from right to left and then back up. So if you compare the two, this is a fine shot, but I think that this shot really shows some interest because it gives the viewer some room to explore through the frame, which that is a huge component of all of these tips, is giving the viewer something to engage with visually with your photo. That makes it more interesting, which also makes it more memorable. So moving on, in Morocco here, there were tons of places like this, old, beautiful blue architecture. I shot this staircase head on. I don't exactly know why. Especially, I just noticed that there's a dude bending over there, but fine. But so here, compare that to this shot. Again, changing, looking for angles, making those leading lines more aggressive. And that happens when you shoot at an angle. So now you've got the stairs kind of going up here. You've got the entire pathway going that way. To me, it just looks like a more interesting photo. Same thing. There was this busker in New York City in one of the subway stations, and a lot of times what I'll do is I'll start head first. If we go back to the stairs, I kind of start shooting head on. But then when I kind of get that over that and I start moving on creatively, that's when I start looking for angles. So same thing with the busker. I thought maybe I can do something if I have the busker on the left side of the frame and then wait for the subway cart to start moving. But again, I'm like, okay, this is okay. Let's see if there's something better. And sure enough, moving at an angle, I just kind of pivoted to the left. I asked him if it's cool if I get a little closer to him. He was totally cool about it. And I waited for another subway car, and I even got a bonus of a pedestrian walking by. So to me, when you compare the two, all you do is change your angle and you have a much stronger shot. In Havana, Cuba, this was like the first night I got here. This was my first time to Cuba, and I saw this, one of those typical old cars that, Cuba is kind of known for. And first thing I did was I shot it head on. I got kind of low, so I was incorporating my first tip, which is kind of change your perspective. I got a little low. It's fine, it's a good shot, but again, you change your angle and you have a much more effective shot. I think it just looks really, really cool. Tip number 4 is all about getting creative with how you frame your primary subject. A lot of times what I'll do is if there's something that I want to photograph as my primary subject, I'm going to look to see if there are other ways to frame it. I'm not talking about an actual frame in post-processing or a frame that you put a picture in. I'm talking about using the natural elements or even the man-made elements, if there are some, to frame the subject. So here's a perfect example at Rockaway Beach, again on the Oregon coast. You've got these two haystacks, one with a little keyhole, and I found this giant piece of driftwood just sitting there. And so I positioned myself so that the driftwood frames the two haystacks in the background. And that to me, makes a much more interesting shot than if I was just standing in front of this and photographing the haystacks. Like, it wouldn't be as interesting. I feel like by relegating the subject to the background and have it surrounded by this driftwood, I'm left with a much more compelling photo. Same thing here. How often are we on the coast somewhere shooting the sunset, but there's nothing there, and all you're left with is a blue sky with a sunball, and great, and a bunch of water. Fortunately, at Davenport Pier, they had the old kind of like remnant of a pier, and I used that to frame the sun. It was perfect for that application. Back to Havana, Cuba. Here is a church. And what I wanted to do was try to practice with a little bit of minimalism, but still use some creative framing. So I found this arrangement of trees, and I really like it because you've got this kind of path here to the church. So using the trees to surround the top of the church, I think was great. I really like it. To me, it's a much more interesting photo than if I just took a photo of the church. Same thing, Proxy Falls. I found an area where there was a cutout of the waterfall, so that rather than just taking a photo of the fall itself, I'm able to flank it with these beautiful trees around it, and it just creates a really nice sense of depth. And then finally, this is the Garden of 1,000 Buddhas in Montana, I believe, and there was this Buddha statue sitting in a field, but rather than just taking a photo of it, I went a few feet behind it, and I got low, and I allowed myself to kind of to get in to these reeds so that they created a frame around the statue. So to me, this is very, very interesting, and it lends to the photo overall, kind of creating a sense of harmony, and it connects the two together. And rounding out this video is tip number 5, which is embracing motion. Motion is one of those things that in a still photo, because it is static, can add so much to a photo. Imagine if you're holding something that's not moving, but the subject is moving, or you're moving with respect to the subject. That adds a huge impact. And there are 2 ways that you can introduce motion. The first is just standing still and letting your subject go through the frame, and you capture that with a slightly long exposure. The other way is by panning, where you're actually moving with respect to your subject. So one of the most common ways that I convey motion in my photos, especially my landscape photos, is with these long exposures, usually between a half and 1 second. And you can see that it gives you this really nice sense of directionality, which is important for these types of scenes. So you kind of have that natural movement of the waterfall. Plenty of examples here. This is also important when we're talking about having the subject move through the frame while you're stationary, is you want to find something in the photo, something that's static and not moving, that gives your viewer a sense of what it is that's moving. So here, because I've got the train track right on the bottom of the frame, you can tell, oh yeah, this is a train, there are the wheels, and it's busting through the frame. So that to me gives the viewer a kind of a sense of logic to the motion. Same thing here, shot from the top of a hotel over Times Square in New York. Fortunately, there were a bunch of yellow cabs, which made it a lot easier to see the motion. And I did this because it creates a sense of interest for the viewer. Rather than if I took a fast exposure or the cars were all still, I think that would fall flat compared to this type of photo. And then you can always have some fun. This on its own with motion is great. This is my buddy Colby Brown. We went to Iceland and we were shooting these icebergs. And so I had him stand still just for a half a second while I took the photo. But a rogue wave came and almost knocked him over. So I managed also to get that shot of him backing away. Again, motion adds interest. Now, panning. Panning again, usually I set my camera between 1/20th and 1/30th of a second, but you'll want to experiment. And I move with my subject. And so this is in, again, Havana, Cuba. And you can see, I just love that you can see the guy's face in the window looking right at me. And the car is sharp, but the entire scene goes blurry. So it just kind of creates a really interesting feel for the viewer. Same thing here. I was panning with my buddy who had this Ford truck. And here's something, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, but don't sweat it if it's not tack sharp, meaning if your subject is not perfectly tack sharp, don't worry about it. You can see here that my buddy is just slightly soft. Forget it. It's fine. The shot itself is awesome. So it's one of those things where, especially if you only have so many attempts to take the photo, just try to get the best shot. Same thing here. This is at Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo, Japan. And I got this motorcyclist, not totally sharp, but overall the photo itself works really well. And so I let it stay. I think it's great. And this is kind of the example of like, just don't sweat it. This is in Battambang, Cambodia. This was on the Bamboo Railroad. And I turned around and took a photo of our train operator. It's called the Bamboo Train. And you can see that he's not perfectly sharp, but it's one of those things where when you look at the combination of these elements here, the subject matter, the motion, the processing, it just kind of, it's okay if it's not perfectly sharp. In my book, I'd rather be able to share these photos with you, even if they have just a slight bit of softness to the main subject, rather than just put them off to the side because I missed critical sharpness or critical focus. And so there you have it. Those are my first 5 tips on how to take better photos. I genuinely believe that if you put these into practice, you will start to see notable improvements in kind of the strength of your compositions. So with that, let me know if these tips were helpful. Did it spur any ideas for you? Remember, I've got a bunch of other tips. This is the first in a series of these types of videos that I'm going to be doing. Be sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like this video. Again, questions in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button so you get notified of all of my future videos. All right, everyone, I'll see you on the next one.